So for this video you need one of these templates and you need to cut it out on the black line, and then you need a piece of calico that is 18 centimeters by the whole width of the roll. Now what you can do is you can measure 18, snip it and then rip it, and you'll get a length, you'll get a really clean rip that way. You can see it and it rips along the grain line nice and straight. And then what you're going to do is you need to cut 6 lots of a center front and a side front. 3 of these sets will be used for this video and 3 will be used for your edge finishes video. So what I've actually done here is I've cut this width of the roll in half, and then I've folded it into thirds so I can pin and cut out 3 sets. You'll notice with my pinning I've put them all in the corners, and now I need to cut this out. So I've cut these out. One thing I forgot to mention is your grain line has to be parallel to the selvage or the fold, and your center front line has to be parallel. Now we have our 2 pieces, but we've got this notch here, our bust point notch here and here. We need to snip that to mark where that is. Now when we're snipping it, we just want to literally cut the length of the notch. We don't want to do extra or too small because we won't see it. And we want to cut through all layers. Once you've done that, you need to go to a machine, thread it up with matching thread. Okay, so our first step is we're going to put these 2 together. So we take 1 center front and 1 side front. If I can grab it. And then we're going to match those edges, and especially match the notches. See there? So what you can do is put those notches together and then put a pin in there, like that. And then we're going to sew these together. So we're going to sew these with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. So this line here, this one here, which extends down to this 10 line, which refers to 10 millimeters, is what we're going to put our edge of our fabric against. So you've noticed I've only pinned the notch. Should be able to manipulate the fabric to meet together with your hands. So I'm just going to bring those edges together at the top. Pop it under, line it up with my 1 line, and stitch it together. Remember to always reverse, and when you're sewing you're just watching that line to make sure the edge of your fabric stays lined up. Now I'm going to stop, take that pin out, and then I'm going to readjust my fabric at the bottom here to make sure it meets. Pinch that together, and about halfway between the notch and the end, I'm going to bring these layers together as well. So you're stitching together 2 different shapes, so you might find that they don't really want to work well together, but it's your job to make sure they line up. This looks like I'm getting a little teeny tiny tuck. And reverse at the end. Make sure when you stop that you put your take up lever in the up position. So that is our seam that we've done. So that should be giving you some shape for a bust, as you can see. Now you're going to have to repeat this. Doesn't quite line up at the bottom, but that's okay, it's only a tiny bit. You'll have to repeat this with the other 2, and then we'll talk about our different seam finishes. Okay, so I've sewn all 3 together, And now I'm going to do the first seam finish, which is actually just a plain seam, which we've already done. But what we're going to do is we're going to iron this open. So when we're opening, we want to, ironing our seams open, we want to make sure our iron is set to cotton. Water does help, and if you have some steam in there. And also we can use the tailor's hand to pull the garment over. We want to pull it so we can get a nice open seam. Can finger press a little bit. And also make sure the iron's clean, because sometimes we get a bit of glue on there. So iron that part. Now I want to get the curve. So to get the curve, you need to find a curve that actually fits. See, that one there looks alright. And really carefully hold it in place while you iron. So when you iron your seams open, it helps to reduce the bulk. And it also helps when you line up your facing pieces, when you do a full facing. So if you ironed it well, you should see the stitch line coming through if it's nice and open, and then you should have a nice shaped finish. So that is the first seam finish. It's just a plain seam ironed open. Now for our second seam finish, we're going to iron it open again, and we're going to do a double top stitch. Okay, so at this stage you should have two seams that have been ironed open. One gets put to one side for your plain seam, and then one you're going to use to do a double top stitch. So it's going to be a top stitch on this side of the seam and on this side of the seam. So that's a finish you can choose to do if you want. And it also holds your seam allowance in place, which is nice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up these lines either side with my seam, because I want my top stitch to be even. Okay, so that little line I'm going to line up with my seam, and then I'm going to top stitch either side. So always do your reverse stitch. You could do this closer if you wanted to, or you could do it further away. Now you kind of need to follow the shape by turning it in and using your finger to flatten the section and keep your seam open that you're sewing. Trying to keep that point on the presser foot lined up. And of course finish with a reverse stitch. When you do your reverse stitch, it only has to be a couple stitches. It doesn't have to be like a full centimetre or anything like that. So you should have a nice even top stitch. Then you're going to repeat that on the other side. So again, you're going to line up, I just tighten that, your seam line with just the little edge of the foot there. Again, keep it nice and flat and open as you go around. And finish with a reverse, just a little one. And that is your first seam finish option. So a little double top stitch, just trim your threads. So we've done our two seam finishes. Now we're going to do our third and final one, but we're going to iron it a little bit differently. So this one we're going to iron all the seam allowance towards the center back. So if this was the center front, that means this is the side seam, which means the center back is in this direction. So we'd be ironing it all that way. So again, hold it nice and tight over the tailor's hand. Find a curve that's going to fit, and you're going to iron that over. Okay, so you should have a nice open. So that bit there could be a bit more open, so I might put it on this side and then just re-iron it. Okay, that looks good. So again, if it's nice and ironed, you should be able to see that stitch line from your seam. So back at the machine, we have ironed our seam allowance all to one side. And we're going to be stitching this seam allowance so it sits flat. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a foot's width, which means we line up the edge of the foot with the seam. So our top stitch, we're just doing a single top stitch, should be catching that seam allowance underneath. So reverse. Keep it nice and open and flat, and then when you get to the bust point where it starts to curve, make sure you're keeping it open and flat and lining up the edge of that foot with the seam. Trim your threads, and that is your other seam finish. So just a top stitch, a foot's width from the seam, and each seam allowance is ironed towards the center back. So you can see on the back it's caught the seam allowance. Now if you were wanting to do boning, if your boning was narrow enough, you could actually insert it into this seam. The other option is to create a separate boning casing, which we could do as well. So they are your three seam finishes. So foot's width, single stitch, a narrower double top stitch that has an ironed open seam allowance, catching the seam allowance on each side, and then just a plain seam with the seam allowance ironed open.